The moment provocation finds an entry point, most people believe that provocation begins the moment someone says something offensive, disrespectful, or challenging. A comment is made, a tone feels sharp, and emotion immediately rises in response. Anger, irritation, or defensiveness appears almost instantly, and the mind interprets this reaction as something natural and unavoidable. It feels as though the words themselves created the emotion. But when you observe these moments more carefully, a different process becomes visible. The emotional reaction does not begin with the words. It begins with the meaning the mind silently assigns to them. Between the moment a statement is heard and the moment emotion appears, the mind performs a rapid interpretation. It evaluates the words, compares them to identity, reputation, or expectations, and decides whether the situation represents respect, disagreement, criticism, or threat. This interpretation often happens so quickly that it goes unnoticed. The mind moves directly from hearing the words to feeling the emotion, making it seem as though the reaction was caused by the other person. But the true mechanism operates inside the mind itself. When someone speaks critically, the mind may interpret the comment as a challenge to competence. When someone uses a dismissive tone, the mind may interpret it as disrespect. When disagreement appears in conversation, the mind may treat it as an attack on personal beliefs. These interpretations activate emotional responses that feel immediate and justified. This is the entry point where provocation gains influence. Once the mind interprets the moment as a threat to identity or status, the emotional system reacts automatically. Attention narrows, and the focus shifts away from understanding the situation toward defending against it. The mind prepares arguments, explanations, or responses before it has fully examined what actually happened. In this state, reaction becomes almost inevitable, yet the disciplined observer begins to notice something subtle during these moments. The reaction does not appear instantly. There is always a small space between hearing the words and feeling the emotional surge. It may only last a second or two, but it exists. Within that brief space, interpretation is forming. Most people move through that space unconsciously. Their minds assign meaning to the situation without questioning it, and the emotional reaction follows automatically. But once awareness begins to observe this process, the space becomes easier to recognize. Instead of reacting immediately, the mind begins to watch the interpretation forming. A comment is heard, and the impulse to react begins rising, but awareness steps in before the reaction becomes action. The mind begins asking quieter questions. What exactly was said? Was the tone intentional, or simply careless? Is this situation actually important enough to deserve emotional involvement? Often the answer becomes different from the initial interpretation. Many remarks that first appear provocative lose their emotional weight once examined calmly. A careless statement may reflect someone's frustration rather than deliberate disrespect. A disagreement may simply be a difference in perspective rather than a challenge to identity. By observing the interpretation instead of accepting it automatically, the mind interrupts the mechanism that normally fuels provocation. The words still exist, the conversation continues, but the emotional chain reaction that normally follows begins to weaken. Over time, this awareness reshapes how the mind experiences difficult interactions. Situations that once triggered immediate reactions begin to feel less urgent. Words that once carried emotional pressure begin to feel lighter because the mind no longer treats every interpretation as a fact. Provocation depends on this automatic interpretation. Without it, the emotional energy behind the situation begins to fade. The individual who learns to recognize this entry point slowly develops a different relationship with challenging conversations. Instead of feeling pulled into reaction, they remain aware of the moment where interpretation forms, allowing the mind to remain steady, even while tension unfolds around them. The quiet power of emotional distance. Most people assume emotional reactions are unavoidable. When someone criticizes them, dismisses their opinion, or speaks in a provocative tone, the mind responds almost instantly. Irritation appears, attention narrows, and the interaction begins to feel personal. In that moment, it seems natural to react. After all, something was said, something was implied, and the mind feels compelled to respond. But beneath these reactions lies a pattern that quietly shapes how influence works in human interaction. Every reaction reveals information. When someone speaks and you immediately show irritation, the other person learns something about you. When criticism causes defensiveness, that signal also becomes visible. Even subtle emotional changes, a shift in tone, a tightening expression, A quicker response communicate where emotional pressure can reach you. These signals form the hidden language of social dynamics. People constantly observe reactions, often without realizing it. They learn how others respond to disagreement, how quickly they become defensive, and which topics create emotional tension. Over time, these reactions become predictable patterns. Once someone understands those patterns, they begin to anticipate how certain words or behaviors will affect you. Predictability quietly creates influence. If someone knows that a certain comment will provoke irritation, they understand where emotional pressure exists. If they know a particular criticism will cause defense, they know where your attention becomes sensitive. Even when this knowledge remains unconscious, it still shapes how interactions unfold. This is why emotional distance becomes powerful. The calm individual does not eliminate emotion entirely. They still hear criticism. They still notice tone and behavior. But instead of absorbing the emotional pressure immediately, they create a small distance between the event and their internal response. This distance changes how the situation is processed. Instead of reacting automatically, the mind begins observing the interaction as information. The words are heard, but they are not immediately interpreted as personal attacks. Tone is noticed, but it is examined rather than absorbed. Behavior is recognized as part of the other person's emotional state rather than a direct command for reaction. This observational mindset weakens the feedback loop that normally fuels emotional influence. When reactions become calm and measured, the signals others rely on begin to disappear. The visible markers of irritation, defensiveness, or frustration no longer appear as quickly. Without those signals, the emotional map that normally guides social pressure becomes unclear. The individual who maintains emotional distance becomes harder to read. This does not mean they hide their thoughts or suppress their feelings. Instead, they simply refuse to let every external behavior dictate their emotional state. They evaluate situations before allowing emotion to shape their response. Over time, this composure produces a subtle shift in how interactions unfold. People often sense when their words no longer provoke immediate reactions. Conversations slow down. Attempts to provoke emotional responses lose their momentum. Even confrontational individuals begin adjusting their behavior when they realize the expected reactions are not appearing. The calm observer gradually becomes someone whose internal state remains steady, regardless of the emotional atmosphere around them. This steadiness does not come from forcing calmness. It comes from understanding that emotional reactions are optional responses, rather than automatic obligations. Once the mind learns to observe situations before absorbing them emotionally, the pressure that once drove reactions begins to weaken. Situations still occur, words are still spoken, but the emotional distance created by awareness prevents those moments from easily reaching the internal balance of the mind. The discipline of the unmoved mind. Most people believe emotional control is about resisting anger once it appears. They think the challenge begins after the feeling has already risen, when irritation, frustration, or offense has already entered the mind. At that stage, people try to suppress the reaction, forcing themselves to remain calm while the emotional pressure continues building underneath. But this approach misunderstands where real discipline operates. True emotional discipline begins much earlier than the reaction itself. Long before anger appears, the mind has already decided how important the moment is. It has silently classified the interaction as something worth reacting to. A tone of voice becomes significant. A comment becomes offensive. A disagreement becomes a challenge that must be answered. This silent classification happens automatically for most people. The mind constantly evaluates social situations in terms of identity, status, and validation. When someone speaks in a way that appears dismissive or challenging, the mind quickly interprets the moment as something that threatens its sense of control or respect. Once that interpretation forms, emotion begins to follow. What most people never realize is that the emotional surge is simply the consequence of this earlier decision. The moment the mind labels a situation as important enough to defend, emotional energy begins gathering around it. The body reacts. Attention sharpens. Thoughts begin preparing responses. The interaction becomes something that must be addressed, corrected, or answered. From that point forward, remaining calm becomes difficult because the mind has already committed itself to the significance of the moment. The disciplined mind learns to question this initial classification. Instead of assuming that every remark deserves attention, it quietly evaluates the situation before assigning emotional importance. A careless comment may be noticed, but it is not immediately treated as something that requires defense. A disagreement may be heard, but it is not interpreted as a challenge to identity. This subtle restraint interrupts the chain reaction that normally produces emotional escalation. When the mind refuses to automatically elevate every situation into something meaningful, many interactions lose their emotional intensity before they even begin. Words that once would have triggered irritation now pass through awareness without attaching themselves to personal identity. This creates a different internal atmosphere. Instead of constantly defending thoughts, opinions, or status, the mind becomes more selective about what deserves attention. Conversations remain conversations rather than turning into emotional contests. Criticism becomes information rather than a threat. Over time, this discipline transforms how the individual moves through social environments. While others become entangled in arguments, explanations, and emotional reactions, the disciplined observer remains steady. They listen, notice, and understand the dynamics of the situation without feeling compelled to participate in every emotional exchange. This calm presence often appears unusual to others. People are accustomed to reactions. They expect certain words to provoke certain responses. When those responses do not appear, the interaction begins to shift. The absence of emotional escalation removes the momentum that normally drives tension forward. In many situations, the lack of reaction quietly dissolves the conflict itself. The disciplined mind does not resist emotion by force. Instead, it learns to prevent unnecessary emotions from forming by refusing to treat every external behavior as something that requires personal involvement. With enough practice, this restraint becomes a natural habit of perception. Situations that once felt provocative begin to appear neutral. Words that once carried emotional weight begin to feel lighter. The mind stops interpreting every interaction through the lens of personal defense, and instead begins observing the larger patterns unfolding within the conversation. In this state, emotional control no longer feels like suppression. It becomes the natural result of a mind that chooses carefully what deserves its attention. The authority of the unprovoked mind. Most people imagine emotional strength as something visible. They picture someone standing firm during conflict, responding with sharp arguments, or defending themselves with confidence and force. Strength, in this common image, is expressed through reaction. It is proven by how effectively someone pushes back when challenged. But the deepest form of control rarely appears in dramatic moments. It appears in the quiet absence of reaction. When someone truly masters their internal state, something subtle begins to change in how they move through conversations, disagreements, and social tension. Situations that once demanded immediate response begin to feel strangely distant. Words are heard, but they no longer trigger the same urgency to defend or correct. At first, this shift feels unusual even to the person experiencing it. The mind begins noticing how often people try to pull others into emotional exchanges. A sarcastic comment, a dismissive tone, a deliberate attempt to provoke a reaction. These moments become easier to recognize. Instead of feeling caught inside the situation, the mind begins observing it from a slightly wider perspective. What becomes visible is a pattern most people never notice. Many interactions depend on emotional participation. Arguments grow stronger when both sides react. Provocation succeeds when someone becomes emotionally engaged. Even casual disagreements often escalate only because both individuals feel compelled to defend their position. Without reaction, the dynamic changes completely. When the mind refuses to become emotionally entangled, the energy that normally fuels conflict begins to weaken. Words that were intended to provoke land without impact. Tension that normally grows begins to lose direction. The emotional momentum that pushes situations toward escalation quietly dissolves. This does not mean the individual becomes passive or indifferent. They still understand what is being said. They still notice disrespect, disagreement, or manipulation when it appears. But instead of allowing those moments to dictate their internal state, they remain anchored in a deeper awareness of themselves. Their attention no longer depends on the emotional temperature of the situation. Because of this, their responses become slower, more deliberate, and more precise. When they choose to speak, it is not driven by irritation or pressure, but by clarity. When they choose silence, it is not because they feel defeated, but because the situation does not deserve emotional investment. Over time, this quiet discipline reshapes how others interact with them. People instinctively sense when someone cannot be easily provoked. Attempts to trigger emotional reactions begin to fade because the expected response never arrives. Conversations become calmer. Even confrontational individuals often lose their momentum when their efforts fail to disturb the other person's composure. The calm individual gradually becomes someone whose internal balance cannot be easily moved by external behavior. This stability creates a form of quiet authority. It is not announced or demonstrated through force. Instead, it emerges from the simple fact that their emotional state remains independent of the surrounding atmosphere. Where others react, they observe. Where others escalate, they remain steady. Where others feel pulled into conflict, they remain internally grounded, and eventually something becomes clear. The person who cannot be provoked cannot be easily controlled, because control begins with reaction. And once the mind no longer reacts automatically, the door through which influence once entered slowly closes, leaving behind a calm presence that moves through tension without absorbing it.